I started to wonder and ponder, how did Martin Luther King interact and react with U.S. presidents? Was he resisting, or did he coexist? And using that same online Stanford University MLK Research Education Institute that Carol mentioned before, I want to share with you a few things about how Martin Luther King exactly interacted with U.S. presidents. So Dwight Eisenhower, you may remember, was not a big proponent of civil rights, but he even proposed a civil rights legislation in 1957, and King immediately, with his new Southern Christian Leadership Conference, put pressure on him to pass a rather weak bill. King helped lead a march in Washington in 1957 in support of it and called it a prayer pilgrimage. At the time, Vice President Richard Nixon became very close to King. They met on June 13, 1957, for a long meeting. Nixon came away impressed with King. Nixon later reported to President Eisenhower that he should indeed meet with King. Eisenhower was reluctant to do so, but after some pushing from King, he did in fact meet with him. And it was a significant meeting, and they talked about policy and got really into the thick of things. Martin Luther King at this time was just 29 years old. Though Eisenhower was cordial and welcoming, he told King to have patience and forbearance in racial matters. Among other things, King asked Eisenhower to convene a White House conference on racial relations. None of King's recommendations came to fruition. Jumping ahead into 1960, just days before the election, MLK was jailed in Atlanta after participating in a lunch counter sit-in. Then Senator and candidate for president, John Kennedy, called Coretta, King's wife, and Kennedy's campaign manager, Brother Bobby, made calls to get King out of jail. King then told reporters that he owed a great debt of gratitude to Senator Kennedy and his family, saying, "I'm sure that the senator did it because of his real concern and his humanitarian bent," though he declined at that time to endorse Kennedy. His father, MLK Sr., who up until then supported Richard Nixon for president, now endorsed Kennedy. This intervention by Kennedy indubitably led to other blacks voting for Kennedy in this rather narrow election. As a candidate, Kennedy said that President Eisenhower could have done a great deal for eliminating discrimination in housing with the stroke of a pen. So when Kennedy narrowly won that White House, civil rights groups reminded him by constantly sending him pens. He had more pens in his office than he knew what to do with. Early on, Kennedy met with black leaders, including King. King and other black leaders wanted to move a lot faster than the Kennedy administration wanted to. Kennedy was overall sympathetic, but was pragmatic and had other priorities. Kennedy did indeed issue executive orders, including one on housing, but never really pressed for legislation to be passed until 1963, when King forced his hand with his work in Birmingham, Alabama. Kennedy introduced to Congress a comprehensive civil rights bill that focused on desegregation of schools, restaurants, hotels, and other public facilities. Initially, the Kennedy administration was nervous about the 1963 March on Washington, but he thought that this march would drag down the bill. But in a meeting with Kennedy, King promised it would be peaceful, and Kennedy, watching on TV, admired King's eloquence. 2 weeks after the March on Washington, a dynamite blast at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killed 4 girls. King was devastated and wrote to Kennedy, "In a few hours, I will be going to Birmingham. I will sincerely plead with my people to remain nonviolent. I'm convinced that unless some steps are taken by the federal government to restore a sense of confidence in the protection of life, limb, and property, my pleas shall fall on deaf ears, and we shall see the worst racial holocaust this nation has ever seen." A few days later, Kennedy met with King and other leaders regarding federal intervention. Legislation stalled, and in time, Kennedy was assassinated. King eulogized Kennedy by saying that his death says to all of us that this virus of hate that has seeped into the veins of our nation, if unchecked, will lead inevitably to our moral and spiritual doom, and described Kennedy's life as a challenge to move forward with more determination, to rid our nation of the vestiges of racial segregation and discrimination. On November 25, 1963, just 3 days after Kennedy's assassination, newly sworn-in President Lyndon Johnson called King to thank him for your cooperation and communication. During this phone call, King said to him, "I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try and enact some of the great progressive policies he sought to initiate." The new president then told the mourning nation, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long." Johnson and King's relationship was critical to many important legislative victories, but neither Johnson nor King promoted their rather intimate collaborations publicly. Their advisors on each side viewed each other with suspicion. Nonetheless, Johnson welcomed King's support, strategized with him, and used some of King's nonviolent direct action campaigns to build public backing. King stood behind Johnson as he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law, which outlawed segregation. King offered public support to Johnson during the 1964 presidential campaign. This was a big boost for Johnson because King's reputation was only growing, having just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. King expressed optimism that Johnson's term would benefit African Americans. And after Johnson's sweeping wing, King said, "The forces of goodwill and progress have triumphed." Johnson was determined to create a strong Voting Rights Act and revealed his legislation to King to get his feedback before it went public. Johnson told King that he believed the Voting Rights Act will answer 70% of your problems. However, the president first wanted to move forward with several great society legislation, Medicare, education, and poverty. In the meantime, Johnson wanted King to dramatize the suppression of black voters to build popular support. Johnson asked King to find the most ridiculous illustration you can on voting, point it up, and repeat it. You can see here now a partnership, a real partnership between the two of them. Soon, Selma happened. Bloody Sunday. The UU minister, James Reeb, was murdered. Johnson used language from the movement and from King and got the Voting Rights Act passed. While they had a healthy and most often covert relationship, an issue eventually split them. When asked by journalists in March of 1965, King cautiously stated that he was sympathetic to Johnson's predicament, but he did not believe that violence can solve the problem. In late 1966, King's last phone call to Johnson was made to discuss Vietnam. In the months that followed, Johnson attempted to meet with King on 2 occasions, but King canceled both engagements. Johnson was bewildered and asked his aides to find out why King was avoiding him. King then came out against the Vietnam War. Johnson felt hurt and betrayed because he thought he had done so much for King and his causes. King said, "I was a strong supporter. I voted for President Johnson and saw great hope there, and I'm very sorry and very sad about the course of action that has followed." King was not going to endorse him for president, and soon Johnson dropped out from the 1968 campaign, just a week before King's assassination. But just as he had done with Kennedy's death, Johnson harnessed that mournful energy around King's murder to pass a 3rd major bill, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Even after Martin Luther King's death, the King family, Coretta and King Sr. in particular, formed a close relationship with Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. The Kings and Carters both had deep Georgia roots, and President Carter did all that he could to make Martin Luther King an official national holiday. So from this brief historical overview, I think we can gather up a few lessons for our time right now. 1, getting major civil rights bills passed was a bottom-up process. People were in the streets forcing those on the top to act. King developed and cultivated relationships with presidents and worked with them to promote justice even when he didn't agree with them and his advisors told them not to. He knew the immense power of presidents, and he also knew that he was relatively famous and looked upon as a moral leader by many people across the world, and that he had power, dignity, and worth himself. King swayed and pushed them to act, and in the process formed partnerships. Yet King was also not afraid to take moral stands and part ways. Would Trump's administration truly listen to someone like King? I don't know. These are different times for sure. But it's definitely worth a try. Resistance and opposition was a last resort for King. He would rather stay in relationship and partner with them and persuade them to move forward. So in our work here, whether it's to get bills passed on the state level or whatever justice work we are doing locally, let's focus on civility, building relationships, and pushing people forward in love. That would be the Martin Luther King Jr. way. Amen.